might be the best round of applause I've ever got in my life. You guys know I'm not Jordan Peterson, right? I know he jacked the beard from me and now everybody's getting us confused. It's very difficult. Wow, this is incredibly exciting. This is the beginning of the 12 Rules Tour, and you guys are out here to discuss ideas. Give yourselves a round of applause for that. I mean, this is really awesome. I mean, we're kicking this thing off. I'm joining Jordan on the tour. I mean, really, look around for a second. Like, the world is upside down, and you guys are here because you want some answers. That is incredible. I actually, all right, one person's with me. That's what I like. One person. I like ideas. What about you guys? No.
I agree with that.
You agree with that? Kathy Newman, ladies and gentlemen. You preempted a joke I was going to do in 2 minutes, but I think that worked. Yeah. Jordan wanted Kathy to open, but... So I just had dinner with Jordan. He's incredibly excited for this and kicking this thing off at the Beacon, this incredible place. Everybody that was there, all the agents were there, the book people were there, the managers, everybody. Everyone had steak. Jordan had lobster. Yeah. He actually didn't eat the lobster. He just beat it relentlessly with a mallet over and over. Who's your daddy? This is really exciting. How many of you guys saw my sit down with Dr. Peterson and with Ben Shapiro? Yeah. You know, it's funny because Jordan's got this thing about the lobsters, of course, that you guys all know about. Ben is an Orthodox Jew. So literally for like an hour in the green room, Ben was like, could you just switch it to gefilte fish, please? Okay, now I know how many Jews are in the crowd. Very exciting. Very exciting. How many of you self-identify as lobsters, by the way? It's very important. A couple people. Some lobster. Oh, we got a lobster claw. Look, adults walking around with stuffed lobsters, people. Are we making a difference? You see my point? There is something amazing happening here. I love it. You know, it's funny, I actually, and I think probably similar to many of you guys, I didn't know who Jordan was until about 1.5 years ago. And it was last October, actually. Right. And suddenly, I'm sure it was some of you guys that were doing it, people started tweeting at me, you know, you gotta talk to this Jordan Peterson guy up in Toronto. You gotta talk to this guy. And we had him on my show, and we were building out our studio, so we did a Google Hangout, and the connection wasn't great because we didn't have great internet yet. And I'm doing this Google Hangout with this guy, and I really was just learning about him as I was talking to him. And here's this guy crying over Pinocchio. Sure, Lion King, that makes sense to me. Little Mermaid, Sing, I was hysterical, but crying over Pinocchio. I thought, what is going on here? What is this? What is this thing? And I got to tell you guys that in the last year, I have truly learned what this thing is. This guy is at the forefront, I think, of what all the right ideas are, right? There are a lot of bad ideas out there. Yeah, you can applaud good ideas, that's right. Where's the girl that I was tweeting with before, by the way? You deleted the tweet, where are you? There, give it up for Chloe. She made a mistake with Twitter and then I retweeted her and she deleted it. She's going through a lot. Make some noise for Chloe up there. Goes down here.
I'll go back to China.
If anyone should be building a wall, it's Canada, frankly. Yeah, the Canadians are down with that. Yeah, like Trudeau could build anything. But Jordan, he started, you know, there was this whole issue about the pronouns, right? That Jordan basically said, I am a free man of my own free will and free mind, and the government cannot tell me what pronouns to use. That doesn't mean I dislike. Woo! You guys are very good on the applause. Yeah, you fully realize that this is a live show. I like that. No tape delay here. Applaud, go crazy, you can scream, whatever you want to do. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. My parents are here. This is. Huh? What'd I tell you, Ma? I'm getting on YouTube. It's gonna work out. Okay. But really, all Jordan wanted to do is the exact same thing that any of us want to do, which is exercise our mind. Be able to think the way we think, be able to speak the way we speak, and to understand what the issues of the day are. And since then, in this last year, I mean, I can go down the list of the people that, Eric Weinstein, who I'm sure many of you guys know, coined this phrase, the intellectual dark web. And there is something happening, and you guys are part of it. That's the beauty of it. You guys are part of it. But this guy right here, he really, I think, is the center of it. I mean, this guy's got, I think it's the #1 book in the world. I mean, Bible, Schmible. It's good. And I want to say something else. A lot of people ask me when I do college gigs or I'm out on the street or whatever, people ask me about Jordan. And they always ask me, well, is he the same? Off camera, is he the same? And I got to tell you guys, I know Jordan pretty well now. And it's been an honor and a pleasure, getting to know him. And he truly is the same. He talks as fast when he's off camera. He moves his hands possibly even more when we're together. And he cares about this stuff, and he is living this stuff. And you know what? Just in the last couple weeks, how many of you guys saw all these ridiculous hit pieces about Jordan? Just in these last couple weeks. You can boo that. You don't have to applaud boo by some bad people. Just terrible, right? Like just these endlessly hysterical, dishonest. I mean, the phrase that I've been using is that these people are activists, not journalists. And I was really trying to think, it's like, well, for years, these last 2 years, this guy has caught fire. And it's like, where were you guys? Where were you when we were all having these conversations? And then suddenly, they get it, right? And then they don't know what to do with it. And the reason they don't know what to do with it, is because he's talking about personal responsibility. What are these 12 rules that Jordan's gonna talk about tonight, right? Sit up straight, get your shit together, And that's a beautiful thing, but for the people that want to control you, that's the thing that they hate the most, because they don't want you to get your shit together. And this guy, being around him has forced me, in some ways, to get my shit together. So with that in mind, are you ready? Yeah! Come on, Chloe, I think you can get them to do a little better than that. Chloe, get moving. A little more than that, give me a little more, people. All right, this is absolutely incredible, guys. Really, there is an idea revolution happening in this country. You guys are part of it, but this guy right now is the center of it, and it is my honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Jordan Peterson, everybody.
Well, thank you, God, you guys. You New Yorkers, you're a real tough crowd. Well, thank you. This is just completely ridiculous. It's like really is. Yeah. I came here about an hour and a half ago, and there were people like lined up around the block. I thought, well, what the hell are you doing? You've got seats, Yeah. Well, look, I'm really looking forward to talking to you guys tonight. Really, I'm hoping we'll get right to the bottom of things, man. That's the plan. So I'm gonna just launch right into it. I'm going to talk to you about my book tonight. I'm going to try to go through all 12 rules. And yeah, and try not to get too digressive while I'm doing it. Each time I do this, I try to hit it from a different angle and to expand on the story and to make it clearer and all of that. So I'm going to try to do that again tonight. And start with rule 1. I heard somebody has lobster t-shirt, lobster claws, yeah. That's just one of many ridiculous things that have been happening, But the first chapter, which is stand up straight with your shoulders back, there's a variety of themes that I was trying to weave together, and I think that the 3 themes are something like hierarchy, inequality, and vulnerability. It's something like that. And I'll start with hierarchy because it's really, really an important issue. It's tied integrally into the issue of inequality, but I'll start with hierarchy. So, one of the things that Karl Marx suggested 100 years ago, 150 years ago, and not really all that originally because other people had made the same kind of comments, was that wealth tends to accumulate in the hands of fewer and fewer people. And he regarded that as evidence of a certain type of profound unfairness. And you have to give the devil his due. You really do. You can't make the arguments of those who stand in opposition to you weak. It's really foolish. You have to make them strong, because then if you counter them, you've countered them in the best possible manner. And the thing about Marx's observation is that it was correct. Wealth does tend to accumulate in the hands of fewer and fewer people. Now, having said that, there's some complexities about that absolutely 100% have to be addressed. The first is that it's not always in the hands of the same people. So if you look at how money distributes itself, imagine you're playing Monopoly. You guys have all played Monopoly. Every Monopoly game ends the same way, right? Everybody who's playing except one person starves to death, and the one person gets everything, right? But if you play 10 Monopoly games, that you find it's very seldom it's the same person who ends up on top across the entire set of 10 games. And Monopoly actually has more in common with real life than you might think, because Monopoly is essentially a game of chance. There's some skill in it. But if you run an economic game like Monopoly out to its logical conclusion, what happens is that one person ends up with everything and everyone else ends up with nothing. And that's actually a consequence of the randomness itself. And that's been modeled, by the way, by people who call themselves econophysicists. Like, who knows that there's econophysicists, right? Who would know that those sorts of people exist? But they've used mathematical equations, the mathematical equations governing randomness, to describe how money distributes itself in an economy. And it does just like Monopoly. Now, the real world's more complicated than Monopoly, and it's not only a random game. But there's a fundamental point here, and the point is that in complex systems, inequality tends to emerge. Now, the problem with the damn Marxists is that they lay that at the feet of Western civilization and capitalism. And that's a problem for 2 reasons. The first reason it's a problem is because it's simply not true. And that's actually a problem. The problem of inequality is way more serious than whatever problems capitalism and Western civilization have. Our societies aren't perfect, but compared to most imperfect societies, they're pretty damn good. But the thing that... But the thing that they're being blamed for is not their fault. You cannot lay inequality at the feet of capitalism. And that's why partly I wrote about lobsters. Because whatever else you might say about lobsters, they're not capitalists, right? They don't partake in a free market economy, and their societies aren't socio-cultural constructs. None of that is even vaguely true. It's seriously not true. But they still have inequality, and they still have hierarchies. And so what that means, and it's a point I make repeatedly in the chapter, is that hierarchical inequality is at least 1/3 of a billion years old. And so one of the problems with misdiagnosing its cause is that you lay it at the feet of a system that isn't producing it, or isn't producing it any more than any other system would. But the second is that you actually fail to take it as seriously as you need to take it if you're going to address it. So because right or left, one thing we should all be able to agree on, as far as I'm concerned, is that having people stack up in poverty at the bottom of your hierarchy is not good. Like, who likes that, right? Who, you know, you see people marching, I'm against poverty. It's like, yeah, really? Who's for poverty? Like, no one. You know, it's not like when well-off people walk down the streets of New York, say, and they see someone homeless, shivering away, suffering off to the side, they're thinking, hey man, strike one up for the capitalist system. You know, well, that isn't how people think. You know, they're hurt by it, and they don't know what to do about it. They'll avoid it. Maybe they won't even look. They don't know what to do, but they're not bloody well celebrating it. And perhaps they don't offer money, you know, and there's a variety of complex reasons for that, but that's at least in part because it's not obvious that in a situation like that, money directly helps. Or at least it's not a foregone conclusion that that's the proper solution. So no one likes poverty, and the evidence on inequality is pretty strong from the social science perspective. It's pretty clear that if it doesn't matter what size and unit of social analysis you use, whether it's city, neighborhood, city, state, or country, the more inequality there is, the more the society starts to destabilize, and the more violent the men get. And that's also not good. And the reason the men get violent is because men are more violent than women, and so they get violent first. But the ones at the bottom, the ones who stack up at the bottom and don't see any way of potentially climbing to the top, think, hey, I don't have anything to lose. I might as well throw the whole thing up in the air and let's play a new Monopoly game. Maybe I'll come out on top this time. And that's not good, right? It's not good to have your society destabilized. So we know that there are some parameters within which our societies have to operate in order to maintain their stability. Everybody can agree on that. But enough with the misdiagnosis. That's my sense. It's like, okay, we can have a discussion about inequality and we can agree that it can become a problem. But we're not going to blame it on capitalism, and we're not going to blame it on the free market, and we're not going to blame it on the patriarchy or Western civilization, because that's just wrong. So that's the first thing, and that's really an important thing. Now, the second thing is, well, how do you best, so we'll say that a hierarchy is a permanent element of social organization, right? It runs through the kingdom of life. Any complex life forms organize themselves into a hierarchy, and the winners tend to take more than the losers. That's how it is. Now, I never once claimed, although I've been accused of claiming that, well, because that's how it is, that's how it should be. It's like, there's a big gap between the way things are and the way they should be. Anyone knows that if they're the least bit philosophically astute. You can't say, well, there's beggars on the street and that's how it should be. It's like, that's completely foolish. We want to ameliorate the worst parts of the painful elements of reality insofar as we're able to do that. But that doesn't mean we know how to do it. There's a book that was just published by a guy named Walter Scheidel called The Great Leveler. I believe that's the name of it. It was just came out, and it's an analysis of inequality. It's quite good. It's kind of a technical book, but I'd recommend it. One of the things Scheidel did, he was curious about, well, is there anything that can be done about inequality? And so here's a question, an empirical question, a scientific question. Imagine that you stacked up left-wing governments, and you stacked up right-wing governments, and you measured the levels of inequality among the left-wing governments, and you measured levels of inequality among the right-wing governments. You'd hope, probably, that there would be less inequality in the left-wing societies, because after all, what they're trying to do desperately is to decrease inequality among all sorts of other things. But, you know, as I said, you give the devil his due. They're trying to reduce inequality. Well, Scheidel found there was no relationship whatsoever between the political stance of the government and levels of inequality. And that is not a finding to be, what would you say? To be thankful about, to gloat about, to be happy about. It's actually really quite catastrophic, because what it means is that we don't know how to manipulate socio-political systems to eliminate or even alleviate inequality. We simply do not know how to do it. And that's another indication of just exactly how deep the problem is. Now, I'm going to talk about some potential solutions as we progress, but, you know, we want to grapple with these things like intelligent human beings instead of like ideological robots. You know, and we can say, well, look, obviously the fact that some people have that some people stack up at 0, and 0 is a really hard place to get out of. That's not in anyone's best interest, self-evidently. It's like, okay, well, what do we do about it? The answer is we don't know. Now, I think about and a lot of the things that we try to do about it make it worse. So the other thing Scheidel pointed out, and this is one of the horrifying elements of his book, is there are things we can do to reduce inequality. Mass plagues reduce inequality. Right. War reduces inequality. Why? Because everyone ends up at 0. And that reduces inequality. And when everyone's dead, they're all equal. And so those aren't solutions, I think, that we should necessarily be pursuing. But as far as Scheidel could tell, there aren't any self-evidently viable alternatives. And so then we have another problem too, which is, see, one of the things about capitalism and about the West, I would say in general, is that while we produce inequality, because we are producing inequality, we also produce wealth. And that's pretty new, right? In 1895, the average Western person lived on less than $1 a day, by today's standards, in today's money. So that's absolute poverty. So the typical person in 1895 was absolutely poor. Poorer than the typical person who lives on the planet now. And so this ability to produce wealth and to distribute it, which is something we're actually extraordinarily good at, is really quite new, and it's really quite fragile. But we're going great guns at it, you know. So I worked for a UN committee for about 3 years on, it was a committee for the Secretary General. It was the production of a report on sustainable economic development, something like that. And it started out, it was really Cold War narrative. It was nasty left versus right narrative, which I didn't like at all. Very pessimistic, very anti-human. You know, we're destroying the planet and we're horrible people and all that sort of absolute pathological rubbish. And so, oh Jesus, really, you know, enough of that. Seriously, enough of that. And so we tried to update the narrative from like 1984, which is where it was basically stuck, you know, and pointed out that a lot of things are really going well. You know, if we had any sense, collectively, we'd be celebrating. I follow this group on Twitter called humanprogress.org, which I like quite a lot, and they tweet out real positive things, you know, not feel-good stories, but like data-driven, optimistic news. And they had a mock-up of the New York Times front page recently that they tweeted, and it said 186,000 people lifted out of absolute poverty today. And then the cut line was, we could run that every day for the last 20 years. It's like, you think about that, you know? So the number of people in absolute poverty in the world fell by 50% between the year 2000 and the year 2012, which was 3 years faster than the most optimistic projections had suggested. It's like, yes, man, that's so good. You know, and the same thing is happening on all sorts of fronts. So, you know, the fastest growing economies in the world right now are in sub-Saharan Africa. It's like, and that's partly because the Africans have got a hold of cheap computational technology, right? Which is a massive deal. You hold in your hand a computational device that puts the computational devices that were used to launch the Apollo space program absolutely to shame, right? And everyone has one, and those who don't will have one soon. And, you know, that's one of the things that starts to make you rich. And about 300,000 people, hundreds of thousands of people a week are being hooked up to the power grid. You know, and we're kicking the hell out of child mortality and also all-cause mortality and extending life radically. And people are literate, way more literate than they were 50 years ago across the world. It's like a lot of really amazing things are happening. Partly what's happened, I think, and this has made things more difficult in the United States in particular, is that a lot of the advances made by the working class in places, say, like India and China, have been purchased at the expense of an increasing standard of living for American working people. And so they're the ones who've really paid for this. But, and that's sad, and it's hard. But it's not so bad that the Chinese aren't starving, you know. It's not so bad that the Indians aren't starving. There's lots of them, and if they're in the economy and producing and moving themselves up to middle class, it's like, that's a pretty damn good deal. And one of the things that really shocked me, well, particularly when I was helping write this report, was like, what the hell? Why don't we know this? Why aren't we, like, having a little party or even a big party about it instead of, like, biting off our own legs, which we seem to be doing in the West right now with all this idiotic political polarization? Like, things are not so bad. I mean, there's still a bloody catastrophe, right? Because life is a catastrophe. But comparatively speaking, it's like, Well, and what's doing that? Well, I can tell you, it's not communism that's doing that. That's for bloody sure. What's happening is the free market, essentially, the free market is making people rich. It's increasing inequality at the same time, but at least while it's increasing inequality, it's stopping people from starving to death. I mean, that's something. So that's chapter 1. Well, there's a bit of an injunction in chapter 1 too. In rule 1 there, it's like, so you have to battle with a number of things in your life, and you have to battle with the tragedy that's your life, and you have to battle with the fact that you're not everything you could be and probably never will be, and you have to battle with the fact that you've got an evil heart just like the person next to you. It's like there's all sorts of things that you have to contend with in life that are very, very difficult. The fact of hierarchy and the fact of inequality and all of that as well. That's part of your intrinsic vulnerability, let's say. It's the price you pay for being, as far as I can tell, and we'll talk about that later. The question is, well, how do you deal with that unfairness, let's say, that intrinsic unfairness? Well, people are quite creative. I mean, some of the things we do to combat that's essential inequality is we generate a lot of different games. Like animals basically play one game, and you're either good at it or you're not, but human beings, we play hundreds of games, and if you're not good at one, you can maybe find another one that you're at least not so bad at, or at least improving at, or maybe you can invent your own game. And so that's a pretty creative thing to do, and we're pretty damn good at that. And so that's one solution. But another solution too is to, the question is, if the environment arrays itself into a hierarchy, how is it that you're best situated to play within that hierarchy? And one answer might be to make yourself powerful, in the physical sense, or in the menacing and threatening sense, because especially the people who criticize hierarchy always presume that what makes you dominant in a hierarchy is something like raw power, which, by the way, is just not true. It's true to a limited sense among some animals. It's really not true among human beings. It's not even true among complex primates. Because what's been found among chimpanzees, for example, is that the brutal tyrant chimps tend to be ripped to shreds by the chimpanzees that they're tyrannizing as soon as they have a weak moment. And you don't have to have much of an imagination to see how that plays out on the human stage. And so it actually turns out that if you want to climb a hierarchy, let's say, that the hierarchy isn't a power hierarchy, not in a functioning society. It's more like a competence hierarchy, or more like a voluntary game. And the way that you climb it, actually, believe it or not, is by being a good person. And you might think, well, that's a little naive. It's like, yeah, no, it's not really that naive. First of all, it's not that easy to be a good person. And the second is, it's somewhat self-evident. People that you trust and you don't trust. And once you don't trust someone, you really don't trust them. And it's really hard for them to recover from that. And if you don't trust them, you're not going to play with them. Not if you have any sense. And we're really good at relationship tracking, and we're especially good at tracking behavior that's ethically suspect, and we remember it. Like, one mistake will blow your reputation. It's harsh, but it just shows you how important trust is. And if you act in a trustworthy manner, and I'm not saying this is enough to make your life, all sparkles and rainbows. It's like, forget that. That ain't happening no matter what you do. But if you're someone that can be trusted, then the probability that you'll at least move towards some degree of success in your domain is radically increased. And so that's a good deal. And then the other thing too is that makes you a contender in a hierarchical game is a kind of courage. And it's a funny courage, because it's paradoxical courage. This is one of the things I really like about the narrative structure of Christianity, I would say, because I think Christianity has done a very good job of detailing out this idea, is that if you, the competence that you need to manifest in life, the courage that you need to manifest in life, and it goes along with being someone that can be trusted, is to be someone who will stand up and expose themselves so... well, let's try a different term. Who will accept their vulnerability, right, and take that on as part and parcel of their responsibility. And part of that for human beings is to stand up. Because the most vulnerable part of us is face forward. We're unlike other creatures, right? Because other animals, they go around on all four. Their back is armored, and that's what they present to the world, essentially. But not us. We stand up and make the most vulnerable parts of us front and forward. And there's a kind of courage in that, like there's a willing to take on the catastrophe of existence forthrightly. And that's what rule one is. It's not a finger-wagging injunction to stand up straight, you know, because there's something wrong with you if you don't, although there is. It's an encouragement to say, look, the way that you find out how strong you can be is to accept how vulnerable that you are. And if you think about it, that makes perfect sense, because we are self-aware creatures. We know perfectly well how badly we can be hurt. Well, we also know that we will be hurt. It's not just that we could be hurt. It's way worse than that. It's that we most certainly will be hurt in terrible ways. And to be able to stand up and take that, you know, and to take that like someone who's courageous, it's like, well, that'll float your boat, man. That'll make people respect you. That'll increase the probability that they'll trust you. And it'll allow you to sleep with a good conscience at night. And that's something. And maybe that's about as good as it gets. And so that's rule one. Rule two is an extension of that. You know, it's treat yourself as if you're someone responsible for helping. And you hear from psychologists frequently that, you know, people are kind of narcissistic and they tend to overestimate their skills in relationship to other people and so forth. And I don't really buy any of that. I don't think it's true. I think most of that's a measurement artifact. I think instead that people, my sense of people, from my clinical perspective and from my research perspective, is actually generally the opposite of that. If you sit down and you have a serious conversation with someone, it doesn't take very long if you have this serious conversation, unless they're narcissistic in a really pathological manner, and most people aren't like that. They're so damn painfully aware of what's wrong with them that it's hard to even face. You know, you don't have to talk to someone for very long until they tell you what they've done wrong or how they're inadequate. It's not some whiny game, although sometimes it's that. It's genuine recognition of their shortcomings and faults. You know, and the problem with being an individual person is that, well, you kind of are aware of the fragility of human beings in general, and then not only their fragility, but also their tendency towards malevolence, because it isn't only that we're vulnerable. We're vulnerable and we're capable of doing terrible things, not to ourselves, but also to other people. And not only are we capable of doing that, we've all done it, and we know it. And so you've got that to carry around, you know, the fact that you aren't everything you could be, and that's for sure. And the fact that, you know, you've done some things that really aren't that pride-worthy, let's say. And you bloody well know it, even if you're trying to fight it, if you're trying to avoid it. You might even be more painfully aware of it than you should be, you know, because sometimes I've also seen with people is they're much more willing to forgive other people than they are willing to forgive themselves. And so you think, well, so this chapter is, well, treat yourself like you're someone responsible for helping. You think, well, that's self-evident. It's like, it's not so self-evident. I open the chapter with this observation that if you have a pet, if you go to a doctor and you get a prescription medication, well, there's 1/3 chance that you won't fill it, and if you do fill it, there's a 50% chance you won't take the medication. And so you think, well, maybe there's a bunch of reasons for that. You don't trust the doctor, you're lazy, you don't understand what's going on, who knows. But here's the weird thing. That's not true if you take your pet to the vet. If you take your pet to the vet, well, then you'll go fill the prescription and you'll give the damn pet the medication. It's like, okay, what's going on there? Do you like your dog more than you like you? It's like, yeah, you do. Yeah, maybe even a lot, you know? And, well, and there's some reason for that, because, you know, if you have a dog or a cat, let's say a dog in this case, like, the dog is an innocent creature. It's a carnivore, but it's an innocent creature. And, like, it doesn't have sins on its conscience. You don't expect the dog to be everything it could be. It's a dog, and that's what it's busy doing, right? And, you know, it's pretty happy when it sees you, and it's a pretty fair exchange of affect. There's no reason to distrust the dog. I mean, it might do foolish dog things, you know, like chew a toy when it's not supposed to, but that's about as far as sin goes for a dog. And so they're easy to like, and you're not so easy to like, that's for sure. You know, and, yeah. Yeah, that's, you can tell that, because your family members, they're happier to see the dog than they are to see you. Yeah. So, you know, you got this tough problem, which is, well, you got to put up with yourself, and it's even worse than that because you know who you are. It's like, oh my God, who's going to take care of that? No one. It's like, we'll just let it wander off into a corner somewhere and die. That'd be good. But you know, it's not a good thing. One of the things I learned from Carl Jung, he talked about this Christian injunction. It's from a psychological perspective, which is to treat other people like you would like to be treated. And you know, people often think of that as this injunction to be nice to other people. It's like, that is not what that means. First of all, nice is a very low-end virtue, man. Nice is harmless as far as I'm concerned. That's not a virtue. It's the absence of a particular fault at best. So to treat yourself like to treat others like you'd like to be treated yourself is an equation. So let's say I'm enjoined in some sense to treat you properly, but I'm also enjoined to treat myself properly. And so then I have to think that through. It's like, well, let's say you have a child, you have a son, and you want to treat him properly. It's like, well, you don't just let him get away with everything. That's not helpful. You want to sit and think about what sort of person you would like this child to become. You want to encourage that, right? You want to act as if you're charged with the care of something valuable and precious. And then you do what you can, if you have any sense, to help that person become everything they can become. It's like, well, you have the same responsibility to yourself. Even as, you know, even though you might not think you deserve it, it doesn't have anything to do with deserving it in some sense. It's a moral requirement to view yourself, despite your inadequacies and your faults, as if you're someone who needs to be properly taken care of, and it's a responsibility on your part to figure out what that is. And this actually works, you know. We have this program we designed called self-authoring, and I designed it with two of my colleagues, Daniel Higgins and Robert Peel. One was a graduate student of mine, that's Daniel Higgins, and the other was my graduate supervisor at McGill. And we worked on that for about 20 years, figuring out how to make it accessible to individuals on the web. We wanted to bring psychological interventions to people that were low cost and effective. And we have this, part of this program is the Future Authoring Program, and it's two parts. It's a writing program, because writing, by the way, if you want to straighten out your brain, there's almost nothing you can do that's better than writing. Writing really straightens you out. You know, so, yeah, well, because you're organized at the highest level of your personality. You're organized verbally. And so you have to have an account of yourself. You have to have an articulated account of yourself. That's why you talk to people all the time about what's going on in your life. It's so that you can have an articulated account of yourself. And if you're disorganized at the level of the articulated account, then you're disorganized. You might think, well, who cares? It's like, no, you don't understand. If you're disorganized, you fall into a pit. Like, it's a bad thing. It's like you have a map, but there's stains everywhere, and there's big holes torn in it, and it's half drawn in crayon, and like, you're not getting anywhere good with a map like that. And so you have to be able to articulate yourself. And writing is a very good way of doing that. And in the self-authoring program, you can write about your past, and you can write about your personality, and then you can write about your future. Now, you know, one of the things I've learned from dealing with students forever is that in our education system, this is so weird. I've really struggled with this realization. I had it about 15 years ago. We never sit, I have these students who've been in formal education for 16 years, right? And no one has ever sat them down, even once, and said, okay, look, you got 3 hours. Write about who the hell you should be. And I don't mean you're going to be a plumber or a lawyer or whatever. Fair enough, you know. That is what I mean. It's like, you know, what kind of character do you want to manifest in the world? In detail. And then why? You think, well, why don't we teach people to do this? It's like, it's the only question. It's the only relevant question. It's like, well, if you could be who you could be, let's imagine you had that within the palm of your hands, that it would be possible for you to be who you could be. Let's say that's within your realm of competence. Who would that be? And if the answer is, well, I don't know, and that's the answer, then give it up, man. Because you're not going to move forward with a plan like that. You know, like, and this is a psychological truth. We know already that human perception is organized around aim. Everything about us is organized around aim. Even the way we use our eyes is organized around aim. We're aiming creatures. And how do you not hit something if there's a target there? How do you miss it? Well, one is to not specify the target. So how the hell are you going to hit something if you don't specify it? So it's like, and I know that for most people, life is something that happens to them. They're reacting to things all the time, which means that they're tangled up in someone else's story, or they're pawns in someone else's aims, or they're pawns of the aims of their own unconscious processes, that too. And when you know that's the case when you find yourself doing something that you can't believe you did, right? I can't believe I did that. It's like, yeah, well, there's something in you that had you. It wasn't you, or it was a dark part of you. You know, but there's nothing to replace that. There's no superordinate aim. And so in the future authoring program, we get people to, well, just to think about their lives. It's like, so there's this another injunction in the New Testament. It's a very strange one. It says, knock and the door will open, ask and you will receive. You think, yeah, right. Fat chance, right? Who's going to believe that, right? It's just it's way too, looks too naively optimistic to even possibly be true. But it's a strange thing, and I've seen this over and over in my clinical and my consulting practice and with my students. I'll tell you, man, if you don't aim at something, you will not hit it. And if you do aim at it, the probability that you'll at least advance in that direction starts to, you will. That's what will happen. Now, you aim at something, what the hell do you know, right? You set up your aim, you don't know anything. It's like you're stupid in your aims just like you are in everything else, but at least you're aiming at something, you move towards it, and as you move towards it, you learn something because you're actually doing something. You might learn precisely how stupid you were in your aims, but you learn it precisely. And that's so useful because once you learn something precisely like that, then you can incorporate the knowledge and you can reformulate your aim, and the next aim is not quite so boneheaded. And so what you do is imagine you should be aiming here, but you don't know because you're blind, and maybe that's even moving. And so you're so blind you aim over here. Well, you walk a little ways and you think, no, wrong. Then you aim over here, and you walk a little ways and you think, no, wrong. And you keep doing that, and like it's a winding path. Like it's not the shortest point, not the shortest distance between point A and B, but you're moving forward. And so even if you're doing it badly, you're approximating the ideal, and the more you do that, the better you get at it. And that actually works. And so we ask people, you know, you think, well, what's life? You know, what's your life made out of? Well, it's pretty straightforward, you know. You need some relationships, right? You gotta have some friends, that'd be good. Maybe some of you don't want friends. Okay, you're a peculiar sort and you don't need friends. But no, there are some people who aren't that social, you know, but broadly speaking, a couple of friends is a good thing. Okay, how many? And who? Who should you have for friends? Well, you might think, well, people who are kind of on your side, that'd be good. Or maybe people who at least aren't actively conspiring against you. You know, and you think, well, my friends don't actively conspire against me. It's like, yeah, well, you just think about it for a while and see if that's true. So, and same with your family members. So, and you as well, right? Because you're actively conspiring against yourself as well. So, what if you could have the friends you wanted and you were doing the things you wanted with them, what would that look like? All right, well, what about your career or job? Like, what's that going to look like? How are you going to make sure you're as educated as you are intelligent? Something like that. How are you going to take care of yourself mentally and physically? If you could do it whatever way you wanted. How are you going to handle temptations? Drug and alcohol abuse, for example. How are you going to regulate that? What are you going to do with your time outside of work that's productive and meaningful? Well, that's not a bad start. It's 6 dimensions, you know. It's like, okay, you can have what you want, or you can have what you need if you were taking care of yourself. But you have to specify it. Okay, so we tested that. We made this program, we tested it in Holland. First, we tested it in 3 universities, and under pretty rocky conditions in one college, we just had kids come in for their summer orientation and just spend like an hour writing. So you hardly even start, you know, with your plan. But it's a plan, and that means you're the planner. That's a good thing to learn. You're not just this thing that's being pushed back and forth by by evil fate. You've got the grip on things, and you're at least contending. It's like, well, people were 25% more likely to stay in university. And the effect lasted more than 2 years. So that was amazing, and grades went up as well, about the same amount. And the people that it helped the most, which was really weird, because usually if you do a psychological intervention, you say there are people not doing so well, and there's people who are doing pretty well. You do an intervention, the people who are doing well do even better, and the people who aren't doing so well, they just stay where they are. But that isn't what happened with this intervention, is the people that weren't doing very well did way better. It was like, well, they never had a plan. So they make a half-hearted plan, it's like, they're way better. Well, so that's something to think about. You don't want to take care of yourself because you should, or because you're compassionate, or because it's a moral, or because you're compassionate, let's say. You want to take care of yourself because, well, this is at the center of things as far as I'm concerned. And this is something I truly believe, despite my black heart and essential pessimism, is that, you know, every human being is a spectacular miracle. That's really the case. And, and that's part of the secret. That's part of the secret of the West, is our legal system is predicated on that idea. It's predicated on the idea that you're made in the image of God, let's say, and that even the law has to stay a distance from you because you're just that remarkable. And I believe that that's as close, that's literally true and metaphorically true at the same time. And I think that everyone knows this, because if you don't treat yourself like that, you don't do very well. And if you have friends or family members and you don't treat them like that's true, they don't like you very much. And if you organize a society on axiomatic principles that don't include that idea, then those societies become unproductive and murderous almost instantly. And so to me, that indicates there's something true about that, let's call it metaphysical claim. And if it's true, well, then you have an obligation to take care of yourself. And it's not just for you. That's the thing. It's not selfish exactly, although it is, because you should take care of yourself. But if you don't take care of yourself, then like, what the hell good are you to your family? You know, and what good are you to your community? And it's like, you might be really useful to your family. You never know, you know, you might be the thing that stands in between them and some catastrophe. And for all you know, you might be that thing that stands in between your society and that catastrophe. And I actually think that that's the case. You know, I read the great commentators on the 20th century catastrophes, right and left wing alike. And the really profound ones all say the same thing. Societies degenerate into hell when individuals abdicate their moral responsibility. It's like there's a direct connection between you stepping up to the plate, say, in relationship to yourself, and the stability of the world. And I actually think it goes beyond that. I truly believe this. I think we don't construe who we are properly. We don't articulate it properly, even though we act it out. I think that what you confront in life is something like an infinite landscape of potential. That's the future. You don't live in the present. The present's already here. And the past, it's too late. But the future, it's right in front of you. And you're interacting with that potential future. It could go this way or it could go that way. And you can see those potentials manifest themselves in front of you. And you make these decisions about which part of that you're going to make into concrete reality. And so I don't think that it isn't just your stability that your decisions depend on. It's not just your family's stability and flourishing. It's not just society. Those are all important things and they all stack up. I think that you play a role in directing the structure of reality itself. And I think you bloody well know that. And we call each other on it all the time. Say, you're not living up to your possibility. You're not living up to your potential. It's like, what the hell does that mean? Everyone says it. Everyone's embarrassed because they know it's true. You're not living up to your potential. Yeah, I know, God, you know. I know. Don't bother me about it. It's like, you're ashamed of that. Well, why would you be ashamed of it? You are. Well, why? Well, because it actually matters. Like, it really matters. Unless you think that it's okay for things to degenerate. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So that's rule 2. It's like, and that's worth, and like, look, I came to this realization. It wasn't an easy realization to come to because it just doesn't seem that self-evident. But I'm telling you, people like Viktor Frankl and Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Václav Havel, people who really grappled with the horrors of the 20th century, trying to understand how a society like East Germany could emerge where 1 in 3 people was a government informer. Imagine that. You get 6 people in your family and 2 of them are informing on you to the government. How does that happen? Well, it happens because the individuals in the society abdicated their moral responsibility. That's how it happens. You might think, well, a lot of people have to do that. It's like, yeah, we don't know how many people have to do that before things tilt seriously sideways. And it might not have to be that many. And it does matter. You know, I see people. This is actually why I decided to do what I did with regards to my stance on compelled speech in Canada. You know, people have been patting me on my back for my bravery, and I think, no, you don't understand. It's like, it's not bravery, it's fear of the right things. That's wisdom. Wisdom is fear of the right things. And you think that it's dangerous to say what you have to say, let's say. You just try not saying what you have to say. You just try that for 10 years and see where the hell you go. Because every time you have something to say, which is something to live, right? There's no difference. There's no difference. Every time you have something to say, something to live, and you step backwards, well, I don't want to cause any trouble. You know, and fair enough, you know, because don't go causing too much trouble. But it's eating at you. You have something to say. It's like, no, I don't need to do it. I don't want the conflict. I don't want the trouble. It's like, fine, no problem, no problem. You're an inch shorter. And the people who are conspiring, let's say, against your essential best interests are 3 inches taller. You think, no, I'll say something in the future. No, you won't, because you'll end up an inch tall facing a monster. And if you can't speak now, what the hell makes you think you're going to speak when that is the situation? That's not happening. So when I decided to oppose this legislation, I thought, well, I got, you know, catastrophe to the left and catastrophe to the right. And that's a good thing to know about life. That's a good thing to know, is that lots of times that's what you've got. There is no easy way forward. Well, there is no easy way forward in life, period. That just doesn't exist. You get to pick your catastrophe. And I knew by that point that I'd rather have the catastrophe of saying what I have to say than the catastrophe of not saying it. And that's not bravery, it's just bloody well, it's open-minded attention, right? It's like, it's wisdom garnered from looking at how things go catastrophically wrong and deciding that I'd rather not participate in that. So rule 3, make friends with the people who want the best for you. That's a harsh chapter. You know, because it's an extension of the moral obligation idea. So there's this psychologist named Carl Rogers, and Carl Rogers had this idea that in therapy you should have unconditional positive regard for your clients. And he didn't really act that way, and that's because he actually can't. But there was something about what Rogers said was right. Like, it wasn't formulated quite right. You want to have... So I reformulated, and I think I got it closer to what it should be. When I see my clinical clients, or when I interact with people in general, what I try to do is to think, well, there's part of you working for you, and there's part of you that isn't working for you. That's that eternal divide in the human psyche, right? There's that division in all of us between good and evil, essentially, which is a real division. It's a real division, that's for sure. And what I want to be with my clients is I want to be on the side of the part of them that's on their side. And I'm not on the side of the part of them that's not on their side at all. That's right, that part can just go, that part can just go to hell. Right, which is where it's headed. And that's the thing that you also want from your friends. I think, again, that falls under the rubric of moral obligation. You know, you want to have friends. This doesn't mean you shouldn't help people. That isn't what I mean. I don't mean that at all. Because everybody needs a hand from time to time. But you are obliged to surround yourself with people who are aiming up Fundamentally, even in their flawed way, you know, like everybody's got their problems. But you're obliged to be around people that are aiming up. If you're not, part of that is you don't want the ethical burden of surrounding yourself with people who are aiming up because they make you look bad. And that's not an excuse to have friends that aren't good for you. It's also not an excuse to have family members that aren't good for you. You know, and I've had, in my clinical practice in particular, I've had situations where the best thing for my client to do was to cut themselves off from almost all of their family, almost completely. There was just no other possible way, because they were surrounded by people who were hell-bent on destruction. And so you think, well, you know, these people you love, it's like, yeah, fair enough, you know, I get that, and it's no fun being alone, and it's no fun distancing yourself from people you love that hate you. But, and so that's rule 3. It's like, it's a hard book, this one. It's a harsh book. So rule 4, compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today. So I formulated that rule because I was thinking about hierarchy again. So we already talked about the downside to hierarchy. The downside is, well, there's some people on the top and there's some people at the bottom, and the bottom is a painful place to be. And so one of the consequences of erecting a hierarchy is that you erect a structure of inequality, and then that can get really steep and out of control. That's a big risk, right? So you might think, well, let's just flatten the hierarchies so everyone's equal. Well, then you think, well, first of all, really? You want to flatten all the hierarchy? Which hierarchies are you going to leave intact? Any of them? There should be no differences between people at all. Really? Or we're going to draw some line there where some differences are okay and other differences aren't okay. Who's going to draw those lines exactly? Like, I mean, exactly who's going to draw those lines? And the answer to that is the people that you least want to draw those lines. That'll be the answer. Because they'll be the only ones interested in doing it. Okay, but we could get more deeply into it too. So here's a peculiarity about human beings. So we can start from a dark place, because that's always realistic. People believe in dark places, man. Everyone believes. You believe in your pain. No one doesn't believe in their pain, right? Nobody's an agnostic with regards to their pain. Everyone believes that it's real or acts like it. So we can start there. Life is painful. It's emotionally painful, it's anxiety provoking. And then of course there's the malevolence aspect, which makes it even worse. And so that's the baseline. And you're stuck with it. And there are times when it will become excruciating, right? To the point of being unbearable. You know, you see people fight at a deathbed. That's a good example of a nice combination of catastrophe and malevolence, right? Because it's already pretty bad. Someone's dying, that's bad. It's like, yeah, but little work, you can make it a lot worse. So I've often wondered, you know, just exactly what would be left of the tragedy of life if people just didn't make things worse. And one of the things I have observed as a clinician is that people can tolerate quite a lot of tragedy, but they can't tolerate very much having everyone make it worse just for the sake of making it worse, right? And that really hurts people. If you're around people who are bringing you down just for the sake of seeing you suffer, that really does hurt people a lot. That's malevolence. I think that's the best definition of evil, really, is to produce suffering for the sake of the suffering. It's like an art form. It really is. It's the right way to think about it. People don't like to think that way because, well, for obvious reasons, like who would make an art form of evil? It's like, how about the guy who shot up the elementary school in Connecticut? How about him? You don't think that was an artistic statement? You just don't have the imagination for it if you don't think that. I mean, just think about it, right? You're going to make an artistic statement that's associated with malevolence. Well, who are you going to hurt? Well, not adults. At least they're guilty of something, for God's sake. You don't want to go after the adults, even if they're innocent adults. No, you go after children, elementary school children. You really want to make a statement that's malevolent. Then you do the worst thing you can think of to the people who deserve it the least. And if you don't think that there's an aesthetic element to that, like a deeply considered aesthetic element, then well, then you haven't thought about it very much, and I can understand why. Like, who wants to think that way? But, you know, we need to understand these things because they keep happening. And you don't understand them without going very dark places. And chapter 6 in my book is called Put Your House in Perfect Order Before You Criticize the World. And it's actually about the mass murderers and why they do what they do. And I know why they do what they do. I actually make a case for it in the chapter. It's like, here's the reason. It's perfectly understandable. Life is very, very, very difficult. And it's often unfair, and we're brutalized at the hands of other people. It's like, that's enough to produce resentment, even in people who are doing well. But there are people who are not doing so well, and they've had pretty damn rough lives, and they've been brutalized a lot, and their lives have been tragic, and they've been betrayed. And they get really, really, really bitter about it. And not the sort of bitter that, you know, keeps you up for a night or two being angry, but the kind of bitter that keeps you in your mother's basement for like 2 years doing nothing but fantasizing about how you'd like to take revenge. You can get some pretty terrible places with 2 years of sustained effort. And there's a reason for it. There's a reason driving it, you know, and the reason is, well, the inescapable brutality of life. Well, there's a reason, but there's no excuse for it, because just because things are terrible doesn't mean that you're justified in making them worse. So, and that's another central element, I would say, of the ethic that has to unite us, you know. You don't have the right to use your tragedy to make the world a worse place. You know, when I say that, I don't say that lightly. Because I know that people can have brutally difficult lives. And that some people have lives that are so brutally difficult that it's almost unimaginable. But some of those people, and I've met people like that, they've had lives so difficult that you just can't, you can hardly imagine it. You know, almost everything about their life is a catastrophe. I met this one woman, I'll tell you a quick story about her. She was an amazing person, man. So I met her in this outpatient clinic I worked for at the Douglas Hospital in Montreal. And the Douglas Hospital was an inpatient psychiatric hospital. It was built in the mid-20th century. And it had hundreds and hundreds of inmates at one point, patients, let's say. But they were all basically released in the 60s during deinstitutionalization, when the psychiatric drugs started to become popular. Some of that was good and some of it wasn't so good. But there were some patients left at the Douglas Hospital, and they were people who were so badly damaged that they couldn't be deinstitutionalized. And well, you've seen street people, and you know how badly damaged they are. They're deinstitutionalized. So just imagine for a minute how badly damaged you would have to be to not be deinstitutionalized. I don't know if you've ever seen photographs by Diane Arbus. She went across the United States and photographed people who were, well, they were strange and hurt people, generally speaking. And the people who were left at the Douglas, they were like Diane Arbus photographic subjects, so hurt and so destroyed by decades of mental illness. And the buildings in the Douglas Hospital were connected by underground passages, partly because it's so bloody cold in Montreal in the winter. You didn't want everybody freezing to death when they were moving from one building to another. And there were a lot of vending machines and so forth downstairs, and that's where the inpatients would congregate. And walking through there was like walking through Dante's Inferno. Like it was really, well, it's surreal. Like, there's no other way to put it. I took my brother with me once. He wasn't accustomed to this sort of thing at all. It just shell-shocked him, you know, and no wonder. So these people were in very rough shape. Anyways, this woman came to see me at the outpatient clinic, and so she had her problems, but they weren't severe enough so that she was an institutionalized inpatient. But she had her problems, man. So she kind of looked like a street person. She had this red down jacket on. It was really dirty, and her clothes were dirty, and she wasn't an attractive person, and she wasn't a young person, and she was so shy that, like, shy doesn't even begin to describe it. Like, she was a whole universe of shy. So she would walk up to people like this. It was like she couldn't stand the light that was emanating from them. She was so shy that was the best she could do, you know, to approach someone like this. Of course, if she's out on the street approaching people like this, it's like she's not getting a positive response, you know, because people don't know what the hell to make of that, especially because she's also unkempt and, you know, and not very verbal and God. So she came to see me, and we were trying to, she wasn't very articulate, because she wasn't very bright, and we were trying to figure out what she wanted. And so for a while, what I was trying to do was to get her to stand up a bit and to take her hand away from her face, just so that she looked a little bit more normal, so that she had a better chance of having, you know, like a reasonable interaction with people. But I talked to her for a while, and she told me a little bit about her life. I mean, God, she was unemployed, obviously, and she lived with her aunt, who was like deathly ill, and her aunt had a boyfriend who was a violent schizophrenic, who was an alcoholic, and all he ever did was like harass her about her being in league with Satan, which was just what you need when you have all those other problems, right? Because, you know, anyways, it's like, you just listen to this, you just think, oh God, it's like, could this possibly be any worse? And the answer is yes, it could be worse even. But here's what she wanted. This is the thing. When after I talked to her, like for 5 or 6 sessions, it turned out she hadn't even come to the damn behavior therapy clinic to get help. She didn't want help. She had this dog, and she used to walk the dog around. And she liked the dog. And she had been in the inpatient ward from time to time because she'd been committed to the hospital, you know. But then she went to the inpatient ward and she saw all these other people who were worse off than her. It's hard to imagine, right? But that's what she saw. She saw these people that were worse off than her. And what she wanted, she was trying to find somebody who was an administrator at the hospital that would give her permission to take one of the inpatients out for a walk when she went to walk her dog. And that was her. It's like, Jesus. That was so, she just, you know, I tell you, like, when she told me that story, it's like, I don't know what the hell you think of someone like that, because, you know, she was so ruined in her presentation, and yet she could see outside her own misery, and as intense as it was, she could see outside her own misery, and her decision was, well, maybe there's a way that I could make something a little bit better for someone worse off than me. It's like, wow, you know, I never forgot her. I'll never forget her. She just absolutely blew me away. Well, she wasn't a bitter person. She wasn't a bitter person by any stretch of the imagination. Okay, well, so back to hierarchies. Well, there's lots of ways that you could be successful in a hierarchy, you know, and she was ethically successful, I would say, that's for sure, and that's really something. And she didn't let her own suffering dominate her psychological reality and determine that the best move forward was to extract revenge on the world. You know, she decided to play a straight game, so there was something, you know, I hesitate to say saint-like about her, but good God, you know, I mean, she had everything you could possibly imagine not going for her, and still, like, how do you manage that? Well, as far as I can tell, you decide. Like, it's not that simple, you know, but there's an element of decision that goes into that. Maybe it's 1,000 decisions or 100,000 decisions, you know, little tiny micro decisions that enable someone to stay on the right side of reality, even though so many things are stacked up against them. Well, so she wasn't bitter. Okay, well, back to the hierarchy idea. Well, life is full of suffering, right? We've already established that. And the question is, what do you have to set against that? And what you have to set against that is actually what hierarchies provide for you. So, because you can't set happiness against tragedy. That doesn't work because you're not happy when there's a tragedy, and so that just doesn't work, right? And you're not going to be happy all that often, and when it comes, like, that's really good and all of that, and you should enjoy it and thank God for it and all of that, but you can't use it as a boat in a storm. Like, that's not happening. You got to have something else. Well, the thing about a hierarchy, a value hierarchy, because all hierarchies are value hierarchies, something at the top is better and something at the bottom is worse. That's really what defines a hierarchy, is that having a hierarchy gives you an aim. And giving you an aim gives you a purpose. And like, we know this, even we know this neurobiologically, let's say. If the baseline condition of life is suffering, you have to have something to offset it. And what you have to offset it is whatever value a hierarchy offers you. Because you need something to aim at. You need something to aim at that makes the suffering worthwhile. That's like the meaning of life. You say, well, what's the meaning of life? It's to have something to aim at that makes the suffering worthwhile, so that you can, when you're in the midst of your limited life, you can say, yeah, but this is worthwhile. This makes it worthwhile. And it's not something you think exactly, it's something you notice. Right? Because you can watch your life for a couple of weeks, detached, and you can watch and you can ask yourself, okay, where is it that I am when I'm doing something that justifies itself? Maybe it's playing music. That's often the case for people who are listening to music, or maybe you're with someone you love, or maybe you're working on something that you're really engaged in. I don't know, it'll be different for different people, but you can be sure that you're aiming at something worthwhile, and you're on the pathway to managing it. And that's the thing about human beings. That's where we get our positive emotion, is we aim at something that's high, and then we move towards it. And if we see ourselves successfully moving towards it, then that engages us with the meaning that makes life worthwhile. And what that means is that if you don't have a hierarchy, a value, and you don't have anything to aim for, then all you're left with is stupid suffering. Because, like, that's not eradicable. Right? There's no way of getting rid of that. Equality be damned. Like, if everyone had everything and we were all the same, well, we'd still be suffering with the burden of being human and being alive. You're not getting rid of that. The only thing you can do with that is justify it. And the only way you can justify something that's that terrible is to be pursuing something that's good enough to make that justifiable. Well, and who knows what that will be. I learned that partly, strangely enough, I learned that partly from watching Pinocchio, which I spent a lot of time watching. And I have a YouTube video about Pinocchio. And there's a scene in Pinocchio where it's a very strange story, and it's full of biblical allegories and deep myths and all sorts of things. But there's a scene in Pinocchio where Geppetto lifts his eye up and wishes on a star. You know, and he wishes that his puppet would become a genuine human being. And that's a very deep idea, but the whole way that's acted out is extraordinarily telling, because a star, think a star is something that glitters in the darkness, right? It's part of the cosmos, it's part of the eternal cosmic structure, which you sense when you look up, right? Everyone who looks into the night sky has a sense of awe associated with confronting the infinite, let's say. It's something like that. So a star is something that partakes of the infinite, and it's above the horizon. Right? So it's something you lift your eyes to, so it's a high aim. And so what Geppetto does is take as the highest aim the hope that the puppet that he's created could become genuine. And there's something about that that's extraordinarily deep. I mean, that's the hope you have for a child, if you have any sense, is that the person grows up to become an autonomous and fully functioning, responsible, awake, aware, conscious human being, right? Not the puppet of some idiot belief system or the puppet of any person, but someone who's admirable and competent and truthful. All of those things. That's a high aim. Well, that's an aim that maybe would justify your life. You say, well, in the face of your suffering, you have this terrible cross to bear. Let's say, well, who the hell could you be? In the face of all that, you could be someone strong enough to bear it nobly. That'd be something. Who would you be if you were that person? God only knows. It's a task fit for a king. It really is, because it's such an impossible thing to imagine yourself managing. But yet here we are, you know, and that's what's in front of us as our calling. It's right in front of us. Well, you need a hierarchy because you need something to aim at. You need something to aim at to justify your life. It's like, well, the problem with the hierarchy is that, well, maybe other people will attain more than you and you get bitter and resentful. It's like, well, there's a way around that. And maybe this is a way around resentment, which is a very, very, very toxic emotion. It's like, you know, if you want wealth, then there's going to be people richer than you, and you're going to be annoyed about that. If you want fame, the same thing applies, and attractiveness. Any unidimensional system of values is going to put you in a position where you're likely inferior, you know. And even if you manage to max out on one dimension, maybe you're wealthy, yeah, but you're still old and fat and bald. It's like, well, and good luck fixing that with your wealth, you know. You might be a little nip and tuck will help, but still, it isn't going to make you younger. So you're stuck with. The problem with erecting the hierarchy is it produces the potential for resentment, but you need the hierarchy. It's like, well, so how do you deal with that? It's like, well, maybe you're not supposed to be comparing yourself to other people. And there's real reason not to, you know. There really is. Maybe when you're 16, you can compare yourself to other 16-year-olds, you know, but by the time you're like 30, you might as well just give it up, because you're strange when you're 30. You're this thing that no one else is really like. And every other 30-year-old is like that too. And so like, what are you doing comparing yourself to those other people? Because they're really not like you. And I mean, and I noticed this, 30 is when it really seems to kick in. Because you get so particular in your genetics, your biology, your history, your education, your proclivities, your experience, all of that. It makes you a very unique thing. And a multi-dimensionally unique thing. And how the hell are you going to compare that to someone else? Pick one dimension and then fall short. Well, that's not very bright. Like, it's just, well, seriously, it's not a very sophisticated cognitive act. But you still need to see that there's a better, and you need to strive towards it, so you can always use yourself as the hallmark. It's like, you kind of have some sense, as we've already discussed, about how useless and worthless you fundamentally are. You can use that as the hallmark. It's like, it is possible too, and I do this in my behavior therapy practice all the time. It's like, you can probably make tomorrow like 1/10 of, maybe 1/100th of a percent better than today. You could probably do that. There's some thing you could do, minor thing, and I mean, you should aim low, right? You really should, because then you're likely to do it. There's something you could aim at that's kind of low, that you'd probably do, that would make your life a tiny bit better. And so you'd be a better version of yourself. But what's so cool about that is that you don't have to do that for very long before you start hitting the exponential gains. That's part of that inequality distribution. You know, there's this idea. Inequality is a funny thing. We talked about it already, that, you know, a tiny percentage of people tend to take everything in every game. It doesn't matter what the game is, by the way. It happens in pretty much every game. But the way that starts happening to you is by making incremental improvements. Because if you're a little better tomorrow than you are today, then the probability that you'll be able to be even a little bit better the day after that has increased rather than decreasing. Because weak as you are right now, you're able to make yourself a little stronger. Well, so let's say you do that. Let's say, and you can try this as an experiment. This really works. You can say, okay, well, every day for the next year, I'm going to try to make one thing slightly better. And it has to be, you got to be humble about this, because like, you're useless. You're not going to go to the gym 3 times a week, right? You're not going to stop eating like bonbons. You've tried that 100 times and you've always failed. So aim lower. Aim lower. Aim so low that there's a good probability that you'll do it. Which is what you do if you're encouraging a child, right? You try to pick a target that's so easy that it's contemptible, because what good is that? But difficult enough to make a difference, but likely enough so that you'll do it. That's what a good behavioral psychologist does. It's like, try that for a year. Think, I'm just going to take myself as a baseline, and I'm going to look at things that I could improve, that I would improve, and then I'm going to do them. Small things. And so that's where humility comes into it too, because they can't be grandiose things. They might not even be something you'd ever talk to anyone else about, because they're so trivial, you know. But something that you do every day is not trivial. Something you repeat, that's your life, right? Things you do every day, that's your life. And so if you institute that program, think, okay, well, just how far could I get if I did that for a year? Find out. Hell, do it for a month and see how far you could get. You know, and I've got 50,000 letters since August. Something like that from this viewer account I have. Now, obviously, I'm not reading them all because I can't. I put my father on it, so he's like swamped with email, you know. Yeah. He hates it and loves it at the same time. And, you know, it's really quite interesting having these letters, and they kind of fall into 3 bins. One bin is one person in 100 who isn't very happy with me. It's like, okay, so fine. And then about 25% say, and this is what my students have told me for years, they say, look, listening to you has allowed me to put in words things I already knew but that I didn't know how to say. Intellectuals have to be good for something, you know. So hypothetically, that they could be good for that. So, despite all their other sins. So, and then the other ones say, I was in a bad place, you know, I was drinking too much, I was addicted, I didn't get along with my family, I was aimless with my girlfriend, I was nihilistic, depressed, overweight, didn't have a plan. You know all the horrible pits that people can fall in, you know, there's like 30-dimensional pit of hell that people end up in. So they write saying how they were located in their particular bit of hell, and then say, well, look, I've been trying to do some of the things you suggested, you know, whatever that is, be more responsible, or try not to lie. That's a good thing. Try not to lie for a month. It's really hard, because almost everything you say is a lie. It's unbelievable, man. It's unbelievable. It's how much. It's just lie being not merely that it's an outright lie, you know it to be a falsehood, but that you're saying things that have no bearing on your life. Like they're not your things, you know. You're saying them to impress people, or you're saying them because you think they sound good, or who knows what, or it's stuck in your mind, or you read a book and you think those are your ideas now, or something like that. All lies, you know. And so you can just stop doing that, and that'll straighten out your... It's horrible to stop doing that, because you find out that almost everything you say is a lie, and that's so depressing to realize that, you know. But do people say, well, you know, I've been making incremental improvements, and it worked. It worked. It's so fun. This is one of the things that's so fun about what I'm doing. What I'm doing is completely insane, and there's lots of it that isn't fun at all. But there's some of it that's just great, you know, because wherever I go now, people come up to me on the street and they say, here's the little, you know, place in hell that I was 2 years ago, and then they describe it and they say, look, I've been trying out some of the things you've been recommending, and it's way better. I think, oh, good. That's so good, you know. And so, well, that justifies all of this as far as I'm concerned. But it's a testament to the strength of just exactly doing that, is you can use yourself as your own marker. You know perfectly well that there's more to you than meets the eye. You absolutely know that. That's so cool that everyone knows that, right? And we have this deep shame that's sort of associated with original sin. That's how the Catholics put their finger on it. We all have this deep shame because we know we're not who we could be. It's like, okay, that's an optimistic thing. It's like, you're not who you could be. All right, who could you be? Well, maybe you could be just way better than you are. And who knows what that would do. And why not find out? Because, like, you don't have anything better to do. So you might as well find out. So that's an optimistic message in the middle of all the pessimism. Rule 5, don't let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. I thought that would be the most contentious chapter, because it has to do with disciplining children, which is, you know, that's a touchy subject. But there's two elements to that rule, basically. One is, it's an injunction to clear-headed, pessimistic thinking, I would say. Because the first thing you have to do if you're going to abide by that rule is you have to admit that your children can do things that are dislikable. And everyone knows that, obviously. I mean, when you were a kid, there were kids you hated, right? It's like, so how has that changed? And you know, your friends have kids. You don't like them. Some of them you don't like, and it's because they're horrible little monsters, and their parents let them do, it's true, and their parents let them do all sorts of reprehensible things that are absolutely in no one's best interests, and they're kind of embarrassed about it, but in a sort of smiling way, and they won't do anything about it, except then you don't invite them over anymore, and they wonder, oh, you know, none of my friends like me ever since I had kids. It's not that, it's your kids, their kids, your kids that are the problem. It's not kids. And so you have to admit that kids can be dislikable. Well, that's hard to actually say that, because, you know, kids are, oh, they're wonderful. It's like, well, they are, but we don't have to be stupidly naive about it. So then you have to admit, that's even worse, that your kids could be dislikable. That's a lot harder thing to swallow. And then you have to also admit that you're the sort of person that could dislike your own kids. And if you don't think that, then you're dangerous. You're dangerous if you don't know that. That's one thing you definitely learn as a clinical psychologist, is because, like, half the people that you see come to see you because their parents brutalized them in every possible way, sometimes physically, sometimes sexually, more often mentally. You know, I've had clients who, the parental rule was, wait till your kid does something good and then hit them. You know, and maybe physically, that's not even so bad. I mean, it's bad, but that's not the best way to really go after someone if they're doing something good. You know, you want to wait till they do something good, and then maybe you want to demean them you know, like with a few cutting remarks over like an hour, something like that, and really rub it in. Do that 200 or 300 times to your kid, and they'll be very, very careful about ever doing anything good around you again. And, you know, then you win, right? Because, well, then you get to be martyr parent who has this terrible child that you have to lug around who's always ungrateful. You can whine to your relatives about it, and they can pat you on the back for being so compassionate and tolerant. It's just absolutely sickening. And it happens way more often than you think. And if you don't think that you can do that, if you don't think that you can do that, then you don't know anything about yourself or about other human beings. Because you bloody well can do that. And the probability that you've done some of that is virtually 100%. So, you know, you need to know if you're a parent, and just if you're a human being, that you are some type of monster. And you should be very careful with how you act. And part of that is you should be very careful with your children. Like, I knew by the time I had kids, I kind of knew what I was like, although not as much as I might have. But I knew something about what I was like, and I thought, I'm not going to let my kids make me upset and angry. Because God only knows what will happen if they do that. And it isn't like an explosive outburst of temper or something like that. You know, you hear now and then about a parent who's done something absolutely dreadful to their children, and you think, well, how could that happen? Just think about it for a while. If you actually want to know how something like that could happen, you just have to sit and think about it for about an hour. Like, it's horrifying to put yourself in the place of that parent. People generally won't do it. But if you want to understand, you can understand. It's just that you don't want to. And no wonder. But I knew, you know, that I was perfectly capable of taking revenge on anybody that crossed me, let's say. And that the best way to deal with that, apart from trying to improve my own character and listening to my wife when she's trying to, you know, sort me out, was to not encourage my children to be horrible little monsters. Because they're little and fragile, and I'm way bigger and way meaner and way more malevolent. And so it's much better for them if they behave in a manner that elicits the positive element from me. And it's not that hard to encourage children to do that. Like, if you have some sense and you notice your own irritation, I mean, you can't assume you're perfect, because you're not, and you're going to have arbitrary irritations, but that's partly why you have a partner to kind of keep you on the straight and narrow. But you do your children a great favor by not letting them act in a way that irritates you. But even more importantly, and this is where the rubber really hits the road, is what's your role as a parent? To promote the self-esteem of your children. It's like, no, that is not your role. That's boneheaded psychologists have told you that. Your role is to make your children welcome wherever they go. That's your role. Your role is to help your children maintain that gloss of innocence and attractiveness that's part and parcel of being a child, so that when they interact with other children, those children want to play with them. That means your child has to know how to play. It's super important that your child knows how to play with other kids, because other kids socialize your children. And if your child isn't socialized properly by the age of 4 so that other children want to play with him or her, they're done. You've failed and you can't fix it. So it's really because what happens is the kids play with the other kids who can play, and their development takes off, and your kid who can't play gets left in the dust. And there's a huge literature on that. That's very, very depressing literature, like most truthful psychological literatures, and that's what it indicates. And so, well, it's the case. You know, if you're a social scientist, you know you've discovered something true if you hate it and it violates your political instincts. It's like, oh, look, a fact! Yeah. So, and then what you also want for your children, like we taught our kids how to behave in restaurants. We'd take them to restaurants when they were little, only for about 45 minutes when they were little, because you can't expect a kid to sit for too long. But, you know, the rule was, well, you can come to the restaurant, but you have to act like a civilized creature. And if you didn't, then we went and stood outside. You know, and even if it was winter. So I can remember my daughter, who's in the audience tonight, by the way, she'd be standing. She'd misbehave in the restaurant. Pull some stunt, because kids will do that. You take them to a new place, they'll pull some stunt they never try at home. It's because they know, and they think, what are you going to do if I do this here? It's like, I'm going to take you outside. We're going to stand where it's cold. So we'd stand there. She'd look at me, and I'd look at her and say, how's this going for you? It's like, I'm cold. It's like, yeah, it's cold out here, eh? It's like, was it better in the restaurant? Yeah. Do you want to go back in the restaurant? Yeah. You want to act like a civilized human being? And we'll go back in the restaurant. It's like, yeah, okay. Back we go, It was pretty straightforward, So, and that worked. But what was so fun about that was, first of all, we got to go to restaurants, and so that made us not quite as bitter and horrible about being parents as we might have been. And the second was, that other adults who didn't know the kids would respond to them really positively. So we'd take the kids to restaurants, and they'd all sit there and smile and eat and, be civilized. And then other adults would come along and say, they'd pat them and say, you kids really behaved well. And they'd actually smile at them. You know how if there's a kid at a restaurant causing all sorts of trouble, you kind of smile, but like a carnivorous vampire, that's sort of how you smile. But the kids would go out, and because they were behaving, with a certain amount of propriety, then all the adults would show their good side, because adults actually like kids. Like you have to be a pretty dark person to not have a small child light a little light in your heart, And so, as long as the child isn't doing everything in its power to extinguish that light, then, you can get some positive responses, even from really rough people. And so the kids would go out to restaurants, and people would pat them and smile at them. And why wouldn't you want that for your kids? You want your kids, so other kids like them. What a deal. Then other kids like them and invite them to play games, and they have a good life. And adults want to have them around and will be nice to them and teach them things. It's like, you're done. Parent, you're done, right? And you can do most of that by the time the kid's 4. So, but you have to come to terms with the fact that kids aren't innately good, and neither are you, that's for sure. And so you have to act like an intelligent person with some apprehension of your own horror and the terrible things that you're capable of doing, and then regulate your household so that those things aren't necessary. And so that's really useful. So that's rule 5. 12. Rule 6. Put your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. So, I wrote this about the mass shooters, mostly. Not only, I talk about this guy named Karl Panzram in the chapter, and Panzram was this mass killer. He kept track of everyone he killed. He kept track of all the buildings he burned down and their dollar value. He was out for mayhem, man. And no wonder, he was a delinquent kid. I think he was one kid of 14 or something in the Midwest. And he was kind of a bad kid. And then they sent him to a reform school, and they did not help. Put it that way. He was seriously brutalized in the reform school. In all the inventive and creative ways that you might imagine that a child could be abused in a reform school, that basically happened to him. And when he came out, he was not a happy person. And so he decided that he would devote his life to producing as much misery as he possibly could. And he wrote an autobiography. He was in prison, beat half to death by the guards, and no doubt deservedly so. And a doctor in the prison gave him $1 to buy cigarettes or something like that. And Panzram, in his own account, said that that was the only kind thing that he could remember anyone ever doing for him. Well, and no wonder. I mean, it's a complicated story, but it wasn't like, he was like a dog that comes up to you and bites your ankle and is surprised that it doesn't get petted, So, and I'm saying that with some due regard for the fact that he did in fact have an absolutely dismal life, right? I mean, he got tortured pretty badly very badly when he was a teenager. Anyways, Panzram writes about his hatred for, it's not just himself, but for other people. Absolute hatred. But it went way past that, because, if you're going to hate, you're only getting warmed up if you hate yourself and other people. you think, well, that's about as bad as it can get. It's like, no, like, there's this old idea that hell is a bottomless pit, you know? And there's a psychological reason for that, and the reason for that is that no matter how bad something is, you can make it worse. And so, like, there's no limit to hate. And you might start by hating yourself and other people, but that's just beginner hate. If you really push it, not only do you come to hate, you come to hate being itself. The mere fact that there is anything fills you with rage. But that isn't even where you don't even stop there if you're really proficient at hating. That's kind of a philosophical hate. And you're getting pretty down to the bottom of things when you're philosophical in your hatred, but you're not as far down as you could get. If you want to get right to the bottom, you get theological in your hate. And if you get theological in your hate, and I don't care if you're an atheist and you're full of hate, it doesn't make any difference. That's all irrelevant. You act as if there's someone responsible for the horror of being. Let's call that God. And you hate him. And then you do everything you possibly can to make that being, hypothetical or otherwise, as angry and sad about your existence and about existence itself as you possibly can, with all of the imagination and tools at your disposal. And then you're getting way down in the hate hierarchy when you do that. And if you don't believe that, go read about it. Go read the diaries of the kids who shot up the Columbine High School and see if that isn't exactly what they say. These people, you know, they write manifestos. They tell you exactly what they're thinking, and that's exactly what they tell you. And that's what Panzram said. He said, you know what his dying words are? He said, I wish the human race had one neck so that I could put my hands around it and squeeze. That's one of the quotes. That's a pretty good one. His dying words, he was being hung. There was a women's group that tried to stop him from being hung, and he wasn't very happy with them, by the way, and let them know that quite bluntly. And he said, he was in Indiana, he said to the hangman, hurry up, you Hoosier bastard. I could kill 10 men in the time it's taking you to noose that knot. Right, that's Carl Panzram, man. That's really something. So the chapter's about him, and it's about the Columbine kids who left a pretty decent stack of writings, and about the guy who shot up the elementary school, about people like that and what their motivation is, and why they're so angry, like so unbelievably, hellishly, satanically angry, because that's the only language that really suffices to describe that level of outrage. You're not even close to describing what's going on in situations like that. You find yourself forced to use a theological language. It's the only language that suffices to encapsulate that kind of absolute brutality. It's hellish. They make a powerful case for it. That's the thing. It's powerful enough to convince them of its rightness. So I looked at that, and I thought about it a lot, you know. It's like, because life is very hard, and people do get betrayed, and there is malevolence in the world, and like and I don't think there's a single person alive who doesn't at some point think, well, maybe I should end it. That's one thing. But not even that, to think, well, maybe this is just so terrible that it should just not exist at all. And you'll find yourself in situations like that when your dreams are dashed, really in an unpleasant way, or someone close to you has a very, very painful illness, something like that, especially if it's a child. It's very easy to find yourself questioning whether being itself is a justifiable, if reality itself is justifiable. It's like, because of all its suffering. So, what do you do about that? So there's this book I read called The Cocktail Party by T.S. Eliot, and in The Cocktail Party, there's a woman who speaks to a psychiatrist, and she says that her life isn't going very well, and she's suffering a lot. And she tells the psychiatrist, I really hope that this is my fault. And the psychiatrist says, well, what do you mean you hope that this is your fault? Why would you hope that? And she says, well, look, if it's my fault, then maybe I can do something about it. But if this is just how it is, it's like, if this is just the structure of reality, then I'm lost. You know, and that's a really good thought. well, T.S. Eliot was a genius, and that's a really good thought. It's like, and it's a really good place to start, because you think, well, when everything isn't going your way, and that's going to happen a lot, you know, when there's suffering, the suffering in your life exceeds what you think to be reasonable, and you're tempted to curse fate with all that that entails, you think, well, have you done everything that you could do? Have you put your house in order? Like, there's opportunities that are sitting there in front of you. It's like, have you made full use of them? Right? Have you, imagine, because life is so difficult, that you don't get to waste, you don't get to waste it. You don't get to waste resources. They're too precious, because you have too big a problem to solve to, like, waste resources. So if things aren't turning out for you exactly the way you want them to, it's like, well, how much time are you wasting? I ask my students, they're 20-some years old, a crowd of them, maybe 200. I say, okay, how many? Let's do a quick analysis of your life. How many of you waste an hour a day? It's like everybody puts up their hands. 3 hours a day. Everybody puts up their hands. It's like usually by 7 hours a day, some people have their hands down, right? They're just wasting time like mad. And we do a quick financial analysis, because, like, if you're a university student, maybe your time's worth $50 an hour or something like that. If you consider it in terms of, you know, lifetime earnings, it's like 7 hours a day, it's $350 a day, it's about $2,000 a week, it's about $8,000 a month, it's about $100,000 a year. It's like, fine, it's like your life isn't everything it could be, and you're wasting $100,000 worth of your time a year. It's like, maybe, possibly there's a causal connection. It's worth contemplating, right? And this is an existential question. It's like, and I don't know the answer to this, because I do know that life is brutally difficult and that we're up against it all the time, both in terms of tragedy and malevolence. It's no joke, man. It's full frontal attack if you're a human being. It's like, what do you have to mitigate against that? And the answer to that is you have what presents itself to you as possibility and opportunity. That's all you have. And so then you might say, well, if you made full use of everything that was offered to you, what would your life be like? And that's a thought that you can use productively in pretty much every situation forever. And there's something about it that's really, like, it's a really profound idea, because it is the case that you have, I actually think this is the case. I think that what we confront, this is how I think reality is constituted. I think that we confront reality as divine centers of consciousness. I don't think there's a better way of saying that. And the reason I say that, divine, is because we don't understand consciousness at all. We don't understand its relationship to material reality. And we do know that it's integrally involved with being. No consciousness, no one to experience. What is there? Well, you can't even say. We confront potential consciously, and we interact with it. Well, how much potential is there? Well, we're very finite and constrained, like a genie in a lamp. Just like that. That's why that idea exists. We're constrained, you know, and there's reason for that. It's a complicated reason, but we won't go into that for a moment. But what we confront seems to be something that's essentially infinite in its potential. So then you think, well, if you have an impossible problem, and you do, you have an impossible problem, and so does everybody else. What do you need to solve an impossible problem? You need infinite potential to solve an impossible problem. Well, maybe you have that right in front of you. And I actually think this is true. I think that if you conducted your life as if what you had in front of you was infinite potential, then you'd find out that that was true. And I think that in interacting with that, you'd also find what you needed to justify the catastrophe of your life, because that's what you need to do. And maybe you could even find it so that you would accept it. You'd accept because I try to develop this too in the rest of the book, and I think I'll probably close with this. I thought about my son when he was a little kid, you know? He was about 3. He was a super cute kid. I still think he's cute, but he's like 26, so he doesn't care. So he's a really cute kid. But you know, he's 3, and 3-year-olds, they're like, they stand up under tables and bonk their head, and like they fall down the stairs, and other kids push them over. It's like, you know, you're pretty fragile when you're 3. And it's kind of painful if you're a parent noticing how fragile your children are. And so you think, well, it's painful, all that fragility. And then so I did a little thought exercise. I thought, okay, well, let's dispense with the fragility since it's so painful. It's like, well, he shouldn't be like 3 feet tall, because that's not working out. 20 feet tall, that'd be good. And then, well, he can't really be made of flesh and blood because, well, we know we know that that's a problem. It's like, how about titanium? We'll just replace him with robotic parts, so he can be 20 feet tall and made of titanium. You know, and obviously, you want something like that to be capable of defending itself, so it's kind of a fighting machine. It's like, okay, well, so now I can dispense with my 3-year-old son and I can have this 20-foot tall robotic fighting machine that's more or less indestructible. It's like, who's going to make that trade? And that's strange, eh? Because it's not obvious why you wouldn't make that trade, but what happens is that by sacrificing that fragility, which is what you'd be doing, you actually end up sacrificing what you love. And so then you think, well, isn't that a funny thing? Because we love people. You know, we all have someone we love if we're the least bit fortunate. And so often our children, hopefully. But then there's that. But if you see this also when your parents get older, you know, they start getting fragile in all sorts of ways. And you think, well, God, it's not so good that they're so fragile. It's like, okay, start replacing it. Well, where are you going to stop? You're going to stop with all of that fragility gone. It's like the person's gone then. And so then there's this strange way where if you love someone, you simultaneously love and accept their fragility. And that means that in some way you actually think it's justifiable. That's what I thought about my son. It's like, no, I think he's fine just the way he is. Like 3 years old, got his problems, you know, certainly gets hurt a fair bit and is probably going to get hurt more, but I'm not trading him in. I like him just the way he is. And so that's like it's a realization of the soul that there's something about the fragility of human life that's actually valuable. And it is the limitation. That's the thing that's so cool about it, is that it's this limitation that we are, because that's what we are, is we're limitation. We're potential conjoined with limitation in some sense. Think, well, we want to get rid of the limitation, but it's not the case. We have to keep the limitation because it's integral to who we are. And so we're in this situation where we have to be limited, and we have to accept it, and we have to confront what's essentially an infinite potential to help us manage it. And I think that's true. And I think that's how we act. I think it's what we expect. I think it's what we need to know. Because you have to say, and that's part of standing up straight, right? And accepting the tragedy and catastrophe of existence. This is partly why I think the West got it right. Because I do think we got it right. The central story, we're a Judeo-Christian culture, and there's a central story at the bottom, and the story is about the radical acceptance of fragility. That's what the crucifixion represents. The fact that that's a voluntary act. And it's about everybody. That's the thing. It's about everybody. It's that, well, you're going to die. You're going to be betrayed. Those are going to happen. And so you can either shrink from that and maybe envelop yourself in bitterness and hatred. And no wonder, no wonder. Or you can say, bring it on. Bring it on. And so I would say, well, I've looked at dark things as much as I can, you know, and I think that's probably hurt me in many ways, but it's been unbelievably helpful, you know, because the thing about darkness is it makes the light stand out. And as I've looked deeper and deeper into terrible things, I've also realized that there's something amazing about human beings. You know, because our lives are bounded by tragedy, and we are capable of deep malevolence, more so than you can almost imagine. But I don't think that's what defines us. I really don't. I think what defines us is the ability to transcend that. I truly believe that. And so I'm not pessimistic, I'm optimistic. And, and I do believe that people are embodied miracles. I really think that's the right way of thinking about it. And I think we all know this. And what I'm hoping in these polarized times is that we return to that realization, and that we adopt the responsibility of full individual being as an antidote to, well, idiot political polarization, but also as an impetus for us all to move forward into the future. We're in an inflection point, I think, in our culture, in the world. Things are opening up in front of us that have never opened up before. It's very dangerous. Our technological prowess is very dangerous, and things could go very dreadfully wrong. But I don't think they have to. I think they could go extraordinarily right. And I think that each of us, I do believe this, that every single person sitting here, every single person there is, but every single person sitting here plays a key role in that decision. We're all part of it. We're deeply networked. We all influence everyone else. And we are these divine centers of consciousness that are separate but united at the same time. And the decisions that each of us make as individuals are far more important than we realize. Our lives are ultimately meaningful, I think. And that we do decide whether by our actions we're going to bring a worse or a better cosmos into being. And I would say that we should dispense with our resentment and our bitterness, despite the fact that we have every reason for it, and stand up and face things forthrightly and speak the truth and make the world a better place. That seems like a good place to stop. Thank you.
Thank you.
Am I mistaken, or he only knocked out 6 rules there, huh? You guys want to do this at my place after? Sure. I don't know if I can quite get all of you, but we'll try. We'll see what we can do. All right, Jordan's just taking a second to just have a glass of water and maybe loosen his tie, and then, I guess we can do a Q&A unless you guys fully got all that. Everybody? Yeah, Q&A? All right. Oh, there he is, Jordan Peterson, everybody. All right, so I sense we're going to have roughly 40 billion questions. There's 2 mics on the sides down here. They couldn't do it for logistical reasons upstairs, but we're told we will call on 1 or 2 of you guys if you speak clearly. But why don't we start? Are we over here? Where am I? Oh, I'm looking right over here. Do try to keep it kind of brief and no major oration, so we can get to as many questions as possible. Take it away.
Good evening. My question is for Dr. Peterson. You referenced in 12 rules, and thank you for your time. You referenced in 12 rules the dragon that gets bigger in small increments if left or if ignored. I was wondering if you thought that it was possible to assume that if certain groups on the left, if they achieved what they felt maybe was equity, could that possibly lead to them wanting to then go further and actually subjugate their political enemies?
Well, the problem with the equity idea is that there's no limit to the number of fractionations you can generate for group identity. So there's an unlimited number of dimensions across which equity might be attained. Problem number 1. Problem number 2 is there's an infinite fractionation of group identity. So it's a problem that can never be solved. So, I mean, what groups are you going to make equal?
Can I just a quick follow-up? I guess so just one step further would be then, so if they achieve some type of equity, would they maybe determine that they're not going to be happy until they're in charge of other people?
Well, that question means, well, what's the motivation at the bottom of all this? And I don't believe that the motivation is equity at all. Like, I think the motivation is the upending of the patriarchal tyranny, fundamentally, and that's not the same thing. Those are just mechanisms. Like, having said that, look, I already stated that inequality is a problem. Inequality drives the left. And fair enough, like, that's why you need a left wing, is because inequality is actually a political problem. But the radical abolishment of inequality is not a possible goal. There's one thing I did want to say. We actually have a technical problem in our culture. Okay, and it's something that's worth thinking about. So the technical problem is we can draw a border around the radical right. So conservatives can say, okay, here's some people to the right of me, and they're claiming racial superiority doctrines, let's say. Okay, we're going to put them in a box, and we're going to say, you're not us, and we're not playing that game. Okay, right. And that happened with William F. Buckley back in the 60s when he started his conservative movement and dissociated himself from the white supremacists. It's like, okay, now we know that people can go too far on the right? Those were the Nazis, remember them? And then we know that people can go too far on the left, and those would be the communists and the 100 million people they managed to kill. Okay, so we know that people can go too far on the left. Okay, what's the marker? And the answer is we don't know. And that's not a good enough answer, especially not for people on the left, because they have the same ethical responsibility to dissociate themselves from the dangerous radicals as the conservatives do on the right, but they're incapable of doing it. Now, partly it's technical. It's like, well, you can point to racial superiority doctrines on the right, and you can say, no, we're not going there. What exactly do you point to on the left? Because the ideas in their individual form seem, well, at least harmless, even though they're not. They seem at least harmless, and they have the mask of even something that appears to be beneficial. Now, I think of all the pathological ideas on the left, the most dangerous is equity. I would say when people start talking about equality of outcome, they've crossed the Rubicon. And that it's incumbent on reasonable people in the center and on the left to point that out and dissociate themselves from them. And they're not doing it. And it's not good. Thank you.
If only there was someone that came from the left that had been trying to do that for these past couple of years.
Ruben report.
Hi, Dr. Peterson. All right. I just have to say, I gave up 3 hours of gameplay to come here, and I'm very happy. I'm very happy.
And his question's about Zelda.
Now, here's an interesting spin-off from the JQ that I've been pondering on recently. How do we solve nepotism and in-group preferences in groups with the majority of the power and influence? Is it even a problem at all? By the way, this doesn't have to do anything with race. Any differential factor can be used here.
Well, I mean, I think that we solve the problem of nepotism the way that we have essentially solved it in the West. Our bureaucracies, for example, are basically meritocratic. Now, measuring merit is no simple thing, right? Because it's not easy to establish a measurement that actually has a decent correlation with the desired outcome. If it was easy, everybody could set up a successful business. It's actually very difficult. But we have decided, imagine your institution has a function, okay? Which, is not so difficult to imagine. And then imagine people differ in that function, which obviously they will. Then imagine you could measure those differences. Now, we kind of do that. So, for example, if you're applying to university, you might have to take the SAT, because we know that SAT scores roughly sample the same competence domain that university does. Now, it's not perfect by any stretch. In fact, the correlation between SAT scores and grades is about 0.4, something like that. So leaves about 85%, 70%, let's say, of the variance unexplained. but it's objective and neutral, and it's the best that we've got. And so that's what you do, is you reduce people to individuals, first of all, and then you say, well, we're going to assess you in accordance with your competence in relationship to the function of this organization. And that's all we're going to do. And we do that quite well. Now, it's very difficult, and we can't do it perfectly, but there isn't a better solution. And to substitute instead, like, quotas for race and sex is, well, it's impossibly dangerous. It moves us into the identity politics realm, and that subjugates the individual to the group. And that's fine. If you want, like, untrammeled tribalism, then go for it. But we know where tribalism leads. It leads to death. That's where it leads. And maybe that's what you want. So,
all right, why don't we try one up in this section? Anyone over there? Right there.
Hi, Dr. Peterson, can you hear me?
yes.
Okay. I recently took your the personality test, and I came out high in neurosis.
Yes.
Can you talk is there any benefit to any sort of negative emotion and anger or withdrawal, or is it just something someone has to sort of try to overcome?
Okay, so the question is, the gentleman who asked the question said he took my personality test and scored rather high in neuroticism, and asked if there was any benefit to that. Well, you know, the answer is it's a normal distribution, right? And so sometimes if you're terrified out of your skull and hiding in the basement, then the king's tyrants don't cut off your head, right? So there are times when the environment is so dangerous that you should be terrified all the time and hide. And like lots of human environments are like that, right? You know, in a Western culture, you might think, well, extroverted and emotionally stable is a pretty good solution. Fair bit of positive emotion, fair bit of verbal assertiveness, not too much fear. It's like, well, if you were like an extroverted and emotionally stable in 1930s in the Soviet Union, you were like dead. So, well, yeah, because like if you're introverted and terrified, then maybe you won't be killed. So it's brutal because you have to put up with the neuroticism, right? You have to put up with the anxiety and maybe with the volatility as well. But in a hyper-dangerous environment, it's an appropriate strategy. So now, having said that, I would also say that, you know, if your neuroticism levels are extremely elevated, then there's some possibility that you have an anxiety disorder, or that you're depressed, or that there's something wrong with you physically that you might want to get checked out. So, because there's lots of reasons to be upset and unhappy, and some of them are temperamental, you know, that's just how you're wired, and you can detect that in kids as early as 6 months. But sometimes it's a secondary consequence of, you know, other things that have happened in your life, or general ill health. So I also think I've been puzzling for a long time over why women have higher levels of negative emotion than men. And I think there's a couple of reasons for it. It kicks in at puberty, by the way, because it isn't true for boys and girls, but it is true for adult men and women, and it's true throughout the lifespan. I think the reason for it is that the world's actually more objectively dangerous to women at an individual level, partly because they're sexually vulnerable, and also partly because they're physically smaller. So it makes sense that they'd be more nervous. But then also, I think women are more sensitive to negative emotion because they have to be sensitive to the distress of infants. Because it isn't obvious to me at all that female nervous systems are adapted for the individual female. I think they're probably adapted for the infant mother dyad. And you're a lot more vulnerable as an infant mother dyad than you are as an individual. But I mean, you have to be, you know, if you're a good mother, especially of really young infants, you know, when your infant is sleeping and wakes up and goes beep, your right response is to jump out of bed, awake and alert, and go likely nurse the infant. And you have to be on a hair trigger, essentially, to be that sensitive. Well, you pay a price, like, if you think about it, you pay a price for being sensitive to your infant. Well, why the hell wouldn't you pay a price for that? Because it's really, like, infants are a lot of work. They require a lot of care. You have to be super attentive to them. They're unbelievably dependent. And so to be wired for that means you're going to pay a price, and like maybe it's going to be harder for you to deal with adult males because you're more sensitive to the distress of infants. Highly probable. So these things are, you never get an advantage without paying a price. That's basically the rule from a temperamental perspective.
Right here.
Hi, Dr. Peterson. My name is Giancarlo Patoco. First, I just want to thank you so much for sharing the fruits of your suffering with us and all of the work that you've done. Read about it, love it, appreciate it. Thank you for doing that, sharing the gifts. My question is about technology. I've been doing a lot of thinking about the role of technology in our evolution. It served an amazing purpose in creating distance between us and nature so that we can survive and live longer. But it seems like we've reached a point at which technology is so deeply embedded in our lives that it is preventing us from living a more meaningful life. And I'm thinking specifically of the fact that we now have these mobile devices that are with us except when we're in the shower and when we're sleeping, basically. And now there are waterproof iPhones, so I don't know what's going to happen next. But we have these phones with us all the time, and they've got social media on them that it seems like it's kind of addictive and distracting us from ourselves and our lives. And it's something that I'm exploring and working on and have transformed my life by taking control over. I'm wondering if you have thoughts about the role of technology in our lives and if we've reached a turning point in some ways.
Well, okay, I won't comment specifically on the cell phones. And I think the reason for that is that we're in a place where the rate of technological transformation is so fast that the probability that cell phones will still be the problem in 10 years is 0, right? It'll be something else, and maybe something even more difficult to manage. And so, you know, I talked about this idea that this infinite landscape of potential is opening itself up to us even more right now than it has in the past with this tremendous rate of technological transformation. Well, the question is, the broader question that you have is, how do we deal with this? And that's a great question, and I would say the answer to that is prepare yourself. You know, because if I say, well, there's a lot going to come at you in the next 10 years, and there's no predicting what it's going to be. It's going to be something that can be used for ill and something that can be used for good. Well, but we can't predict it. So what should you do? And the answer is, you should prepare, right? You should eradicate your obvious weaknesses. You should strengthen yourself. You should become more alert and more educated and more disciplined. And you'll do that in your own particular way, and that will make you better, whoever you are, than you are now. And as a collective, that's the best we've got, because, and I mean this at a really deep level, we have become a planetary transforming force. And that's probably really been true since the end of World War II, right? When we invented the hydrogen bomb. It was like, that was a whole new thing. And we obviously have to develop the wisdom that will enable us to manage that. Because what else are we going to do? Otherwise, we're infants with guns. And one of the things I learned from Carl Jung, what I really liked this, is he was very interested in alchemy, which was a weird admixture of ethics, religion, and proto-science. It was the birthplace of science. And it was kind of a dream. The dream was that human beings could investigate the material world and generate the philosopher's stone, which would make everybody healthy, wealthy, and immortal. But there was a dream there. The dream was we could discover that by investigating the material world. And that was the impetus for the development of science. Well, that took off like mad. And in some sense, we have discovered the philosopher's stone. We are much healthier. We live much longer. We're far richer. And that was all a consequence of investigating the material world. But there was a lot of religious and ethical thinking that was part and parcel of the alchemical dream, and it didn't grow the same way. And so it's like we're stuck ethically in like 1600, and technologically it's the 21st century, and that's not good enough. We have to become as powerful ethically as we are scientifically, or we'll do ourselves in. So, and I think that's part of what we're trying to sort out, is what's our ethical responsibility? How good could we become as individuals? And where could that take us if we decide to go there? So, and cell phones are one small but significant element of that. Incredibly powerful devices, but requiring wisdom in their management. And that's just going to get worse, because there are things coming down the pipes technologically that we can't even imagine. So, thank you so much.
Those destructive, despondent type of existential angst and questions we may have, or nihilistic even. But is
it's the antidote to that. It's the justification for it. Yeah, it's not a distraction. It can't be a distraction, because if it's a distraction, it won't work. You know, generally people distract themselves with trivialities. You know, with cheap, impulsive entertainment, and I don't have anything against even cheap, impulsive entertainment for that matter. But it's not something that you do while you're busily suffering yourself into extinction. It's like, I do believe that, I believe that there's evidence for this, that the instinct of meaning is the deepest instinct that you have, and that it actually does orient you to the proper place, whatever that means. It means something biological, it means something political, it means something economic, but I think it means something universal as well. Because I do think that consciousness plays a central role in being. And so if you orient yourself towards what's meaningful, then you participate in all those levels at the same time. Now, I don't know what the ultimate significance of that is, but I suppose it's the same as the ultimate significance of reality itself. But there's something profound to it. It's not just a distraction by any stretch. Like, I don't think we're fiddling away while Rome burns. I don't think you find pleasant occupations to preoccupy yourself while you trudge towards death. You know, it's not like that. It's the orientation towards meaning is a fundamental reality. You're neurologically wired that way, and so it's real. Now, what that means ultimately, I don't know. But one thing I do know that it means is that it means less hell. And that's something, right? Really, that's something. So we could start with that and see where it goes. Yeah.
So, can I stand up?
Sure, if you stand up, then everybody can hear you.
All right, all right.
Really?
Yeah! So I'm 17, and I'm going to be going to university soon, and your lectures were part of the reason why I decided to make my intended major neuroscience,
Yep.
with kind of an emphasis on neuropsych.
Yep.
And I was just wondering, in terms of like the canon of psychological works, you know, Freud, Jung,
Yep.
Rogers, does it matter which order you read the books in, or should I just kind of get
No,
what
I'd
is
start
the
with
successor?
Rogers.
Rogers?
He's easier. Yeah, I mean, Rogers is a very useful thinker, practically. So that's Carl Rogers, the psychotherapist. I'd recommend his writings. He wrote a book called A Way of Being, which is really a great book. It's very practical, you know. Rogers was a very practical person, and I think a good person. But it's very clear. Freud is harder, and Jung is impossible. But worthwhile, but very terrifying.
I bought the red book, and
Oh yeah, no, you don't want to start with that.
tried.
Yeah, no, that's advanced mysticism.
Yeah.
That's partly why he didn't publish it. I mean, he didn't publish it in his lifetime.
Yeah.
So there's a reading list on my
Yeah.
website. And
Okay.
the best thing, if you're interested in psychological theory, I think the best book, likely, especially psychoanalytic theory, is a book called The Discovery of the Unconscious. And that'll give you an introduction to Freud and Jung and Adler, and also to the history of psychoanalytic thought. It's a brilliant book. And it's really quite an engrossing read as well. So that's a really good place to start.
We have time for, thank you very much. We have time for one last question.
Okay. Okay. Who's the girl? Who's there? We go. All right.
You said recently that you'll never grow up until you have your own children.
Yeah.
Coming from a woman who doesn't have any children but is trying to sort herself
Yeah.
out and has mental issues in their history. Is it more important to sort yourself out and do the best you can and try to get to adulthood in that way, or is it really necessary to have kids?
Well, look, you know, this is something Carl Jung said about psychotherapy. He said that it can be replaced by a supreme moral effort. Because Jung, like most of the great psychologists, knew that a lot of what deranges people in their life is falsehood. You know, Freud talked about repression, and Alfred Adler talked about the life lie, and Carl Rogers talked about inauthenticity, and so did the existential psychotherapists. They all had their finger on the idea that to straighten yourself out is a moral effort. The thing about having kids that's telling is that if you have a child, then it's almost inevitable that you will then come to regard someone else as more important than you. And like, I think you can do that otherwise. There's other routes to that, but they're hard. I mean, because there isn't anything that's a bigger commitment, or there are very few things that are a bigger commitment than having a child. And so it catalyzes a change in you that you're entirely prepared for. And I think there are ways of doing that for people who don't have children. It's like, but it's
hard.
That's right. It requires the same sort of effort, I would say, that having a child requires, which is a lot of effort, you know? So, and then when I make statements like that, they have to be, you know, they're punchy and generalized. And it's not to say that there are no people who are mature that don't have children, but the fastest and most certain way to maturity for people is to have a child. That also doesn't mean that everyone who has a child becomes mature, so because they don't. But generally, they at least become more mature than they were, which is something. So, we have to abandon the theater.
Right.